Okay, everyone, welcome to the third lecture for human motor control and learning. Before we get started, I just wanted to clarify the labs and the due dates. So remember, with the end of COVID restrictions, in a sense, the faculty has stated that all labs have to be returning to in-person. And so for this course, that means that the beginning of the muscle function lab will be your return to in-person lab. And that's going to happen on February 14th to 15th, depending on which lab time you registered for. Lab 1 will be completed right now on your own time, and it will be handed in before the start of that lab. So there's 5 different labs, and the way that they are scheduled to be due is that lab 1 is due before the start of lab 2. Lab 2 is due before the start of lab 3. Lab 3 is due before the start of lab 4, and lab 4 is due before the start of lab 5. Lab 5 is due before the final. Each lab runs for 2 weeks, and so what that means is that everyone shows up for week 1 of, let's say, lab 2, which is muscle function. Everyone shows up for week 1. The majority of you will be able to complete it in week 1. But if you need more time, there's always that second week that you can return to lab and finish off data collection or asking questions to the TAs. And so that's why each lab runs for about 2 weeks. If you complete the lab in week 1, you don't need to return for week 2. We have a question from Alyssa. For the current lab, do we just do one of the trials or all 3 of the different? You would just complete one of the trials. So you just use some of the sample data. Cool. And then Brianne is asking a question. Something about, because lab 1 is due around the 15th, we still don't have it scheduled this coming. Yes, that's correct. Because rather than jump in halfway through, I've told the faculty that we would start with return to in-person once we had a brand new lab. And because of some of you have already completed the lab. We had questions about the recordings. So do you see in your modules where it says recorded lecture? There's like the lecture slides and there's tabs that say recorded lecture. If you click on that, it'll give you a YouTube link. And so after the class, we upload the recording to YouTube just because it saves space and it's faster. Jacob, I haven't seen the new sample data. If you ask your TA or just email them, they'll be able to clarify it just because they're the ones marking it. But if you include it, because it was in the sample data, it shouldn't be a problem. So Athenasiosis is asking a question. No, the due dates are just the on Canvas for the labs. It's just at the last possible moment. So regardless of like whether I would go into individually and set an individual due date for all of you, I just set it at the last possible time. And you know that it has to be due before the start of the following midterm or the following lab. So the TAs will know if you don't hand it in. So remember, each lab runs for 2 weeks, and it'll be due before the start of the following lab protocol. Yep, that's correct. So when you submit it, it's through Turnitin. So I think you upload a document on Canvas. Okay. So Jillian, Jacob, and Alyssa, you guys are okay? Boom. Okay, awesome. So this just clarifies the change of scheduling with the labs. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was that if you look on the modules, there is a posting for the assignment and the rubric for the assignment and what is involved in the completion of that assignment. Remember, we're taking a motor skill that you're going to decide on and then answering several questions based on the material of each of the different lectures. It's good to get started earlier, at least look at what's involved in the assignment. It's due before the final exam, but it takes questions from each of the lectures. So if you could think about the motor skill that you want to do now, then when we're going through the lectures, you'll be able to like pick out like, oh, you'll be able to answer those questions as you go along. The assignment itself isn't very difficult. It's just that at that time of year, obviously, there's a bunch of things going on. You can have everything due at the same time. So it's good to keep going now. One thing to mention about the motor skill that you choose is that there's no, people can't double up. And so when you decide what motor skill you want to complete, email your TA and then they keep track of it. If people do the same sport, they'll have to choose different aspects of the same sport. So if two people want to do soccer, they both can't do free kicks. One would have to do dribbling the ball, and then the first person, first come, first serve. So the first person would, let's say, choose free kick. You would email the TA, I want this, okay? And then if someone else wanted that, they would have to pick something else because it's already been taken. So it's in your best interest if you're really into a particular motor skill. Typically, people pick things they're familiar with because they have a greater knowledge base of it. So it's better to just email them now. Any questions about that? No? Or am I on frozen still? Nope. Any questions about the assignment? Can you all see the assignment module on Canvas? Just to clarify that it's up. Canvas seems a bit glitchy, like there's always things coming off, people can't find the syllabus, and I'm not sure entirely why, but when you email me or message me, I just tend to re-upload it and it tends to work for a bit. So if that's ever the case, always just message me on Canvas or email me and then I can fix it. Okay, this is great. So today's lecture isn't very long in a sense that it's mostly a review lecture. So this lecture is a brief review of Intro to Movement Neuroscience. When you see the breakdown of the questions on the midterm, you'll notice that there's a significantly less amount of questions from this lecture. A significant amount of difference, and it's just because this course is the behavioral and sort of research specifics of motor control and learning. But I did want to introduce, to involve a review lecture just to keep in mind that motor control doesn't just involve the ability to activate our motor units to contract our muscles. It's how we control that sort of machinery. And in next lecture, we're going to get into motor program theories. And so before we started that, I just wanted to get us all on the same page of the physiological basis of motor skill, completion or motor skill performance. So this is just a brief review of the neuromotor basis of movement, how our brain activates the different muscles to contract the joints, or to contract the muscles and move the joints in the way that we require them to move to complete the goal of a particular skill. And we'll review that process by looking at the neuron, the peripheral nervous system, and the central nervous system. I'll point out the most important things. But this is, again, just a review so that we're all on the same page. So when we move forward at looking at how our body controls this machinery and sort of the behavioral aspects of which variables in the environment most influence our ability to perform, or which variables in the environment, the skill, or the person allow us to control our neuromotor processes in a better or not as efficient way. So, who enjoyed, none of you had me for intramovement neuroscience, I believe, right? I think Dr. Murphy taught you. Oh, did you? Okay. Lucky you, Maddie. Hey, okay. Oh, right, yes, yes. So that's typically the course that I teach. But what I'm going to do is, I know it's a very content-heavy course. I'm just going to review the main sort of principles. So to intro, we're going to talk about how we control our motor units. How do we activate our motor units in the process that's involved in us contracting our muscles to move our body in the way that we see fit. It involves using our neurological system and our muscles. So this is the neuromotor basis for motor control. And if you remember from that course, our neurological system is divided up into two different regions. We have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. Does anyone remember what counts as the central nervous system? Versus the peripheral nervous system? Yeah. The central nervous system is everything encased in bone. So that would include the brain, everything in the skull, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. At every level of the vertebral column, we have spinal nerves exiting. That is what counts as the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is where our spinal nerves recombine to create all of our big peripheral nerves: sciatic nerve, radial nerve, ulnar nerve. If our brain is processing which muscles to contract, that signal is going to get sent down through the spinal cord and then sent out through the peripheral nervous system, through the peripheral nerves, to contract the different muscles. So our ability to complete motor skills involves first understanding the neuromotor basis behind the control of our body. And what research did was that it's not just how we control the machinery, it's about how the different variables in the environment, the person, and the skill interact that dictate how we're able to control our body or perform motor skills under a wide range of different conditions. You know, like the analogy of playing basketball and being able to be just as good of a jump shot shooter when there's a defender, if you're off balance, or if there is, you know, not a significant amount of time on the clock, or in stressful situations. So let's first talk about the functional unit of the neurological system. So remember, the main point of the neurological system was just to send one signal from one part of the body to another. So that exponentially compounded gives us the diversity and the complexity of the neurological system. But it started off as the ability to send one signal from one spot to another. And the way that it does that is through electrical potential energy. So a potential energy is an energy that can be dissipated. So the greatest analogy would be gravitational potential energy. So if I grab something and hold it up against gravity, it has gravitational potential energy, meaning that if I let go, this is going to fall. With electrical potential energy, we have our sodium-potassium pump that generates this electrical gradient in the neurons because it's pumping ions disproportionately from one side to the other. And what that does is it causes an electrical potential. It causes a charge. And so what that electrical potential energy allows for is discharging it. And so we can lose that potential energy. And that's the basis of this signal. To be able to complete that whole process, the neuron has 4 specific areas that are specific only to neurons. They have a cell body, but this cell body in neurons produces a whole bunch of proteins in the form of neurotransmitters. And when our action potential goes from one neuron to another, or from one neuron to a muscle, it's transmitted to the next cell through the release of these neurotransmitters. Dendrites are the input to the neuron. It's where all of our local potentials, or the stimulus from other neurons or from receptors, all summate together and add up to determine whether or not we have an action potential. The action potential is transmitted through the axon of the neuron. And so this is where we have the discharge of our electrical potential. And then the presynaptic terminal is where that action potential will get converted to a neurotransmitter and sent to the next neuron. There's no audio? Oh, just not video. Okay. Let's try this again. How about now? All right, well. Let's do the old start and stop. You'll exit and then come back in. Better? Just to restart the computer. Okay. I'm just going to pull up our slides. Oh, Casey, did you miss me? So you're supposed to say yes. Yes, we did miss you. Jeez. There you go. Good. See? Can you see the slides, Jaden? Perfect. No, so a brief intermission there. If it happens again, I'm sorry. But the last little bit was talking about the presynaptic terminals. This is where we get the conversion of our action potential into a release of neurotransmitters that allow for the synapse of our electrical potentials. So if you think of a neuron, here we have our dendrites. This would be the input of the cell. This is the cell body that would produce proteins and neurotransmitters and then package them and keep them stored in the presynaptic terminals. This is the axon. This is what generates the action potential. And when it reaches the axon terminals, it causes a release of neurotransmitters. These would float along the synaptic cleft and interact with another neuron and then cause a buildup of electrical potentials and therefore potentially another action potential in that neuron. This is just the process of communication. So this is how we, send a signal from our brain out to the muscles to contract them, but it's also the process in which we become aware of things in our environment through receptors and send that information up to the brain. So remember, with doing motor skills, as you become better and better at performing a motor skill, you're more aware of the different things in the environment. We need to be aware of our environment to understand how we have to modify this motor skill that we've learned to be able to complete it in that real-time situation. The whole process of the action potential being transmitted down the axon and then through neurotransmitters, that signal being transferred to another neuron or another muscle is called synaptic communication. Now, the interesting thing about our neurons is that because they have the dendrites and we have our local potentials that either through the form of receptors or through neurotransmitters, causing either excitatory and inhibitory potentials, we get a summation of all of those small little local potentials. And it's when there's enough of them to cause the buildup of the electrical potential up to the threshold potential, that's when we get an action potential. So the action potential, so once you activate a motor unit, so the motor units are our motor neurons that come from our spinal cord. Once they're activated, it's an all or none response. So as soon as they start, the action potential gets sent down to the muscle, and those muscle fibers it's connected to contract. So it's yes or no. The way that our neurons are put together in that it has to have a buildup of local potentials allows for different stimuli to be sort of integrated or work together or summate. And so it's in this way that we say that the neurons are integrating information. They receive information through the dendrites and then they integrate that information in that there's a summation of all of the local potentials that are either excitatory and inhibitory. So a neuron isn't like a computer. It's not like calculating stuff, but in the way that there's summation allows for the integration of the information. And then it's transferred through the action potential down the axon and then transferred to the next neuron or muscle cell through neurotransmitters. It's just the process of how it works. There was the different types of summation. So this, imagine, is all the dendrites that would have all these different stimuli being inputted at the same time. All of those little electrical potentials add up either spatially or temporally. Is everyone okay with that? Again, this is just to be a general review. Everyone's okay? But think about so I mean, this is like a very anatomy-based lecture, but think about the implications of motor control, for example. So think about how we're able to integrate multiple signals even at the neuron level. And so think about what happens when you are stressed, when you're really anxious and stressed and trying to complete a motor skill. Typically, we're usually not as good at performing. And so maybe there's more input that is like, think about when we're nervous, or we're all shaky, or when you're first, you practice this skill or this sport, and then now you're going to do it in real life in front of people, and you are stressed, and so your body's shaking. The muscles or the motor units, they seem to be more sensitive. They're easier to contract potentially. And maybe that's as a result of, a different type of summation happening at even the neurological level. That signal that is sent out to the muscles, it goes through the peripheral nervous system. So remember, the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the spinal cord. And so our peripheral nerves are bidirectional. They contain axons that run afferently, or information arriving to the brain, and then efferently as well. And that's information going away from the central nervous system out distally to the periphery. So what would be afferent information versus what would be efferent information? Yep. And so think about a completion of a motor skill. We need to be aware of the environment. So that information is going to go through picking it up through receptors. So vision or hearing or touching would be touch receptors, proprioceptive receptors. All of that sensory information is going to be transmitted up to the brain afferently. Your brain is going to process all of that and then figure out and in which way to contract your muscles to complete a motor skill. Is going to send that signal back down through the efferent system. Remember that our afferent neurons are a special subclass of neuron called pseudo-unipolar cells. And the reason why I bring this up and showing a picture is to point out something that in this diagram here, what would be a reason to have, or what would be a benefit of having the cell body outside of the axon? Considering that the axon is what generates the action potential. Yeah, it's quicker. So remember, if we are going to do a motor skill or a purposeful movement to complete a task, we need to be aware of our environment. Sensory is always first. If I want to pick up a cup, I need to be understanding of where the cup is in space, how I'm positioned, if it's moving. You first need to be aware of all of the sensory stuff or the environment for your brain to decide how you need to move accordingly to achieve the task. And so with our sensory neurons, having the cell body outside of the axon makes it so much quicker. And that's exactly the reason Brian had mentioned. It's for sheer speed. And when you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, there's this big bump on the back end or the dorsal side of the spinal cord. That is the dorsal root ganglion, which represents the cell bodies of all our pseudo-unipolar cells. Now, in terms of our motor system, once we've decided how and in which way to contract our muscles, that signal is going to be sent out through the upper motor neurons down to the spinal cord and then out through the lower motor neurons to the specific muscles. The upper motor neurons are going to be from our motor planning areas that we're going to be talking about next. But when we decide that we want to activate our muscles, it happens as a result of contracting or activating our motor units. So the alpha motor neurons are all of those, it's also called, so lower motor neuron, alpha motor neuron means the same thing. They're located in the spinal cord. And what happens is once threshold is reached and there's an action potential in the lower motor neuron, that signal gets sent down. And since the lower motor neuron is connected to only a specific number of muscle fibers, those muscle fibers will contract. And so it's called a motor unit. And the motor unit would represent an individual motor neuron or lower motor neuron and the individual muscle fibers that it is attached to. And muscles have a large number of motor units within the muscle. So if let's say there's 100 motor units for one muscle and I want to contract it by 50%, then I would activate 50% of the motor units. If I wanted to contract it by 70%, I would do 70 motor units. I want to talk about alpha and gamma coactivation because one thing that we notice in people becoming better and better at motor skills is that, and I brought it up in an analogy of like dancers when they're learning a routine initially or learning to dance, they always look at their feet. Humans primarily utilize vision as primary, but as you become better and better at a motor skill, you rely less heavily on vision and you can better utilize your own proprioceptive sense. As you become better and better at a motor skill, you're more aware of your body and space. So you can rely more on proprioception. Proprioception occurs as a result of the use of muscle spindles. And these are our sort of sensors in the muscles that let our body know about the length of the muscle and the rate, the change of length of the muscle and the rate of change. Now, these are like little, like imagine tape measures in the muscle. So when they're under tension, they're regulating or they're reading length. But when you contract a muscle, the muscle shortens, and so the tape measure, which is the muscle spindle, will become all floppy. So what happens is that they have their own muscle fibers that make sure that they stay tight. So anytime that you activate your muscle, you also have at the same time have to flex the muscle spindles in that muscle. So that's a process called alpha gamma coactivation. So when you activate a lower motor neuron through this reflex, you're also activating the gamma motor neurons or the contraction of our muscle spindles. Does that make sense, everyone? It's talked a little bit about in the textbook and the research, so I just wanted to bring it up. Everyone's okay? Awesome. If you were to look at a cross section of the spinal cord or look at it sort of in like a 3D way, each of these blue chunks, like see these blue blobs, they would represent all of the cell bodies for a particular muscle. So let's say this is, I don't know, let's say this is the pec muscle, this is the biceps, this is pec minor. The way that the cell bodies for our lower motor neurons are arranged, or they're all collected together. Ahmed has a question. So one excites and the other inhibits. No. All you're talking about alpha and gamma coactivation? No. So it just means like, so think of the term coactivation means they're contracting at the same time. So if you activate your alpha motor neuron, as a reflex, you're also activating the gamma motor neuron. So your brain isn't deciding, okay, let's activate both. Once that signal gets sent down from the brain down to the lower motor neuron, so depending on which muscle it is, one of these, a reflex also at the same time will activate whatever muscle spindles are in that muscle. Yeah, I would say it's more like a reflex. It's more like, well, it's more of a co-activation. So if you're going to activate the alpha motor neuron, because there's an interneuron that like immediately sends the signal in parallel with the alpha motor neuron or the gamma motor neuron, they just work together. So you can't, because it's connected, you can't activate the lower motor neuron or the alpha motor neuron without at the same time activating the gamma motor neuron. Yeah, awesome. And the reason why we do that is simply because of how important sensory information is, specifically proprioceptive information. We need to be constantly aware of our body's position in space in order to do such fine, intricate movements and learn. So on that point, Ahmed, think of the ratio of the different neurons in our body as this ratio here. So for every one sensory neuron, we have 10 motor neurons. And for every 10 motor neurons, we have 200,000 interneurons. So the complexity of our neurological system is such that signals are always getting transmitted and branching and being affecting different areas, much like what we're just talking about with alpha gamma coactivation. That it's not your brain having to decide, okay, I want to flex my pec, but I also have to remember to flex the muscle spindles in the pec. It's all just happens through interneurons. So it takes away the processing power that the brain already has to do. The brain is already taking all the sensory information of the environment, and then in the motor planning areas being like, okay, I need to move this way, and I need to activate these muscles by this much. It's already involved so heavily in that processing that by having interneurons that transmit signals all over the place and rewire things, it takes away a lot of the processing required. So here we have an example of what an interneuron would be. It would be the smaller neuron between two large neurons, in this case, an afferent and an efferent neuron. Is that okay, everyone? Awesome. So the central nervous system, therefore, we had talked about earlier in the lecture, is just everything that's encased in bones. So that's going to include our cerebrum, our cerebellum, our brainstem, and our spinal cord. And we're going to talk about those areas in relation to specifically motor control. So again, this is just a review, so don't get too overwhelmed, anyone. Michaela is actually studying for this right now, so she could do this part of the lecture if she so want to. I don't even know if she's here still. No, she's good. Okay, that's fair. But here we have a picture of the brain. So we have our cerebrum. So this has the different lobes. And remember, each lobe is a concern with a different function. This is our cerebellum. And remember, this is the area of the central nervous system that's involved in learning all of our motor skills. So what is one thing that you notice about the folds of the cerebellum in comparison to the lobes of the cerebrum? Yeah. And so because they're smaller or the folds are so much tighter, if you look at the number of neurons in our central nervous system, more than 50% of them are actually in this cerebellum. And it's because the folds are so tight, it can fit more into a smaller space. The brainstem is color-coded here in yellow. And this is for our sort of like typically for our regulatory processes. So yes, closer together for more increased surface area. That's correct, everyone. This is important to understand for the purposes of the course, because when we're talking about learning our motor skills, we're going to be talking about where that occurs, and it's the cerebellum. Yes, there's the arbor vitae in the cerebellum. In terms of the anatomy of the cerebrum, so this is the main part. Remember, we had the different lobes, and you must have learned them in Intro to Movement Neuroscience. The brain was divided into two hemispheres, or the cerebrum was divided into two hemispheres by the longitudinal fissure. So that's the longitudinal fissure. Two halves, we had gray matter and white matter. These are the different lobes, and they were associated with different functions. It is, yeah. That's why I did it, Michaela. It was just for you, actually. Now, of the surface anatomy of the cerebrum that was the most important, specifically for the purposes of this course, we were looking at the central sulcus. So remember, the central sulcus was a division, was a line, a sulcus, that divided the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The reason why that was important was because it divided motor from sensory in both sides of the cerebrum. We had talked about the different motor planning areas, the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the supplementary motor cortex. And now that you've had time to sort of review that course and you completed it, now let's just go back into what's the most important part for the purposes of motor skill completion. Think of our motor planning areas as the motor areas that are planning which muscles to contract for whatever we've decided to do. So in the frontal lobe anteriorly is where we're cognitively thinking about what we need to do or what we want to do. The motor planning areas here are going to be aware of what sensory information is coming in. And these are the areas that are going to plan which muscles to contract for whatever we want to do. So think of the planning areas as creating the checklist of which motor units for which muscles to fire. The primary motor cortex was utilized for fine control. It was organized into the homunculus. Remember that? But this is where we're going to have our final checklist of which muscles to contract for fine control. The premotor cortex was going to look at which core muscles are required to be contracted first. So that way we have stable use of our limbs for the primary motor cortex, or the primary fine control. This is also the area that's involved in demonstration or picking up. What was one thing that humans were able to do to learn quicker? Watch someone perform a motor skill and then do that. The premotor area is also utilized in that. And then our supplementary motor area was utilized in organizing motor skills that involve, or movements that involve, both use of the hands and considering for sequential movements, what is the movement coming next. So think of like a sequential dance routine or playing piano, where it's multiple things in sequence. What is coming next is going to impact how we should move. So let's say I'm typing, but I know there's a high note, or I'm playing piano and there's a high note coming up. Instinctively, I know that even though I'm playing, I'm going to adjust my hand position to be able to hit a high note. There was a bunch of motor control studies that looked at piano players, and looking at changes of what if they numb their fingers? What's the difference in how they type, or how they play the keys? And what they noticed that when they were watching them play sheet music, they would instinctively alter their hands for what notes were coming up, even though it was like an awkward position. And obviously the piano players aren't doing it consciously, they're not thinking about it. But it's these planning areas that complete that all for us. So remember, the motor planning areas are the areas that are planning which muscles to contract or whatever we've decided to do. Is that a good review, everyone? Primary motor cortex is for fine control. Premotor cortex is for activating our core to make sure that we're stable while we're completing the task. Also used in picking up demonstration. And then our supplementary motor cortex is involved in coordinating movements that involve both hands at once, and when we have multiple movements in sequence. Yes, so then we don't really talk about it, Casey, but we actually had, so there's motor planning areas. Broca's areas is a motor planning area because talking is a motor skill. So Broca's area is involved in speech because we decide what we want to say. And then rather than say, I want to cuss you all, or I don't know, I want to holler at somebody, how do I do, what muscles am I contracting? How do I move my tongue? This planning area just coordinates it. It's converting the word I want to say into the proper, activation of the mouth and tongue muscles to get that sound. But because this course is about like motor skill or motor control, I didn't bring it up. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. Olu?
Oh yeah, sorry, please can you repeat what you said about the Broca's area?
Yep, this guy?
Yeah.
Oh, so this is a motor planning area that's involved in coordinating which mouth muscles to activate to say a specific word.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to.
Yeah, you remember how like these motor planning areas were figuring out which muscles of the limbs to contract for a movement.
Yeah.
This one's figuring out which mouth muscles to contract to say particular words,
Okay.
depending on what this part of the brain has decided it wants to say.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Now, there are regulatory centers that sort of impact the output of our motor planning areas. Remember we were talking about upper motor neurons versus lower motor neurons? All of the upper motor neurons are coming from right here. So we decide I want to throw, okay, I always say picking up a cup because I want to drink coffee. So I decide I want to pick up a cup. These areas are figuring out which muscles to contract so I can do that. These go all the way down the spinal cord, or all the way out the brainstem down to the spinal cord, and then synapse with the lower motor neuron. So it's just two. But the upper motor neurons are all coming from right here, and they go all the way down to the level of whichever muscle they're connected to. The basal ganglia is a regulatory center. And so what this was involved in was looking at the checklist of muscles I've decided to contract and then adjusting the force of each one of them, whichever muscles, to make sure that the movement is smooth. So it takes the checklist and then looks at it and modifies the force a little bit to make sure that it's a fluid movement. Does that make sense? Awesome. We know initially what the basal ganglia was involved in because before MRIs and all there are different sort of like clinical tools now, they would look at different diseases and what were the symptoms of the disease, and it would give you a better idea of what that part of the brain would do. And so Parkinson's disease was a classic disease that affected the basal ganglia and gave early researchers an idea of what the basal ganglia was involved in. The cerebellum, remember our vitae and all the folds, this area is heavily important for this course because it's the cerebellum where we store all of our learned motor patterns or learn motor programs. The way it works is simply this. And so now that you've had the time to like learn all of intramovement neuroscience, it should make a whole lot more sense when I briefly just review it right now. So do you remember all the tracks from the intramovement neuroscience course? There was two types of tracks that went right to the cerebellum. Remember there was the unconscious relay pathways? There was tracks that are specifically going just to the cerebellum. They're unconscious, you're not aware of them, but that information, and they were huge, are constantly going to the cerebellum. Those two tracks were our internal feedback and our high fidelity tracks. The internal feedback tracks are every time, we were just talking about motor planning areas. Every time I decide I want to activate my muscles, that information gets sent down the spinal cord in the form of an upper motor neuron tract or upper motor neuron, and then goes out to the lower motor neuron and then ultimately out to the muscle. Every time it goes from upper to lower motor neuron, through an interneuron, that signal gets sent back up to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is constantly getting information, making it aware of what muscles we're contracting. The other information that it receives is all of our proprioceptive information. So all of the so we talk about muscle spindles. That information gets sent back up to the sensory system. It also gets, because of a interneuron and its own tract, that information gets sent to the cerebellum. So our cerebellum is constantly aware of what muscles we're contracting and how our body is positioned in space. Constantly. Always, 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 always. Now let me ask you all a question. What is the process typically for us to get good at a motor skill? If I want to learn to be good at throwing a ball, what do we do? Repeat, repeat, practice over, 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 and over again, right? That process is hardwired into us because this is what the cerebellum does. You know, when you're practicing and every little time you get a bit better. So let's say I'm practicing at shooting a jump shot and I shoot it and I'm like, oh, I undershot it. And then so I know to instinctively throw it a little bit harder. And through repetition, you get good, you get better and better and better. What happens is the cerebellum is always comparing what muscles you activated and how your body moved. So every time you're closer to the goal, it remembers the coordination of muscles that you activated or the order in which you activated your muscles. Because as we get better at something, think of kids learning a sport, they're very uncoordinated and they get better and better and better and better. Their body seems to move more fluidly because what the cerebellum does is it is involved in coordination of our muscle activations or coordination of our body. So every time with repetition, you get better and better or closer at achieving the goal of whatever our motor skill we're doing is. The cerebellum remembers that this was the order in which I activated my muscles. That's how it works. Weird, right? So that whole process of practice and repetition, it's all hardwired in the way that we are neurologically. It's not like the Matrix where you can just download a motor program into the brain. Does everyone get that? Jennifer says, makes sense. So does everyone completely get that? Super interesting, right? No, it would only be for Samantha's asking for involuntary movements. No, it's because it's coordination. So it is for learned motor patterns. Jacob, yes, oh my God, downloading. If we could, you know what? Maybe in the future. Jacob's saying if we could download different motor programs into our brain. Ahmed's asking, so it solidifies the pathway for a yes. That's exactly what it does. because every time it's remembering the order or the coordination, the timing, is remembering the timing of how you contracted your muscles. And then so each time you do a repetition, it's changed a little bit based on what you're thinking or what you've noticed. And then it remembers, okay, no, that was a better order. No, that was the better order. No, that was the better order. So with repetition over and over and over again, it's solidifying in which order or the timing of how to activate your muscles. So the reason why it's called high fidelity, like fidelity means like, high fidelity means a high definition. So lots of information. So the high fidelity tracks are because it's taking in all of the proprioceptive information. So it's high def. Internal feedback is because you're getting feedback of which muscles you're contracting. Yeah, think of all that information. That's why the cerebellum has to hold so many neurons. So considering that, Ahmed and everyone in the class, think of how impressive it is that our body is able to learn a motor skill and perform it well, and then be able to do that in varying environmental conditions. Not even like crazy sport, like sports, intricate sports stuff. I'm able to pick up a cup if it's a different size, if it's dark out, if it is away from me, if I'm unbalanced, if I'm sitting, if I'm standing. Your body is able to take the timing coordination in the cerebellum and then add to it the real time environment and execute it. No, reflexes is in the spinal cord. So Olu's asking, what about reflexes? It's still under cerebellum. No, the reflexes, so like our pain reflexes and stuff, that is sensory information just goes out to the spinal cord and then right back out. So it never goes anywhere higher. The brainstem, so continuing on, the brainstem is for our evolutionarily more older processes, like things like regulating body temperature, hunger, breathing rate, reflexes for vomiting, sneezing, all that stuff. And then the thalamus acts as the relay center of everything going in and out of the brain. So what you were, just based on what you were talking about earlier, Olu, with our reflexes, can you explain Ahmed is asking, can you explain the relation of the cerebellum to Parkinson's disease? No, the Parkinson's disease was related to the basal ganglia. So remember, the basal ganglia was looking at the checklist. So let's go in order. So Ahmed, you start first, okay? So I've decided I want to do a particular motor skill, right? That I'm aware of. So my brain is taking all the sensory information and deciding what muscles to contract. That information is processed and sent out, goes through the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia looks at the checklist and says, okay, I'm going to adjust the force of each of these muscles to make sure that it's fluid. Goes down, the cerebellum says, oh, okay, I know this action. This is the timing of the way you should do the muscles to make it like consistent, and then that gets sent down. Because remember, once it reaches the lower motor neuron, it's an all or none response. There's no more altering it. All that processing has to happen in the brain, in the upper areas. Olu had talked about reflexes, and reflexes happen at the level of the spinal cord. And to understand the spinal cord, I'm just looking at a cross-section here. Remember, it's divided up into anterior and posterior, or motor information leaving the spinal cord and sensory information coming in through the back end. So the reflexes would be somewhere in here. These were the tracks. Ahmed's asking a question. So is the cerebellum and basal ganglia, is cerebellum and basal ganglia are parallel in processing, or basal ganglia comes first? Basal ganglia comes first. Basal ganglia will affect the force of muscles. Cerebellum is timing. Perfect. Ahmed says everything makes sense now. That's the plan. I'm trying to make everything seem less complicated. Trying. These were the tracks that we learned in Intro to Movement Neuroscience. Here's a picture of them. We had our motor tracks and our sensory tracks. Look how big the spinocerebellar tracks are. Because of all of that information that has to get into the cerebellum. These were our main sensory tracks. We had our dorsal column and our spinothalamic tract. This was for fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. This was for pain and temperature. They end up in the primary somatosensory area. These were the tracks that go from the spinal cord and the proprioceptors up to our cerebellum. These are the spinocerebellar tracts. And then we had our motor tracks, and they were subdivided into two different sections. The medial upper motor neuron tracts were for core and posture muscles. The lateral upper motor neuron tracts were for fine control. So of our motor planning areas, which one was involved in fine control? The primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, or the supplementary motor cortex? Primary, yeah. And so if you look back at the tracks, look how big the lateral corticospinal tract is. Because think of all the like connections that it would need to make. Versus look at the core posture ones, much smaller. So look at the size of our different tracks. The biggest one is our dorsal column, but look how big the spinocerebellar tracts are, anterior and posterior, like compared to all of them. Because think about all the information that has to go into the cerebellum. And remember, the cerebellum isn't conscious. Things that have to reach the cerebrum, so we're consciously aware of them. The cerebellum is running behind the scenes. So we're not aware of it, because it's not conscious. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up was that we contract our muscles by activating a different number of motor neurons, or sorry, of motor units in that muscle. So if we wanted to, well, the example I talked about earlier was that let's say we have 100 motor units for one muscle. If we wanted to contract it by 50%, then we would do 50 motor units. Or if we wanted by 70%, 70 motor units. We sequentially activate different motor units for a muscle to contract it by a smaller or larger amount. Muscles themselves aren't all or one or all or none response. It's the motor units that are. I wanted to bring this up because there's an order in which we activate our motor units. We usually go from smallest to largest. So there's an orderly recruitment of motor units for a given muscle. That's dictated by Henneman's size principle. And do you all remember that term? Henneman's size principle. You activate your slow twitch muscles first because they're the smallest, and then you sequentially add larger and larger ones so that we get, as you like contract a muscle, each like increase is a gradual increase. The slower twitch ones are the endurance ones. So by having an orderly recruitment of muscles, it allows to maintain endurance. So the ones that turn on first are the ones that can last the longest. So Henneman's size principle just dictates the order in which we would recruit motor units to contract a muscle by more and more. So having said that, does that make sense now, Samantha and Olu? He's saying, so if you pick up a pencil, you don't have to flex the whole muscle, kind of, right? Yeah, like why would you, right? Like if I want to do something small, like if you would want to in an efficient way, try to activate the muscles the least amount that you would want to, or else you'd be like, like smash the cup and stuff. You want So Henneman's size principle, so FODE, do you understand the idea of different motor units in a muscle? Okay, so then if I wanted to activate a muscle by 100%, how many of the motor units would I utilize for that muscle? As a percentage. This is for FODE, Ahmed, but that's fine. So 100%, yeah. Can you agree with that, FODE? Okay, so if I wanted to activate the muscle by 20%, how many motor units or what percentage of motor units would I want to contract? So if I wanted to contract a muscle FODE by 20%, what percentage of motor units for that muscle would I technically want to activate? Yeah, 20. But of those 20, so let's say there's hypothetically 100 motor units, of those 20, which one are you going to choose to activate first? Yeah, so you can't just pick haphazardly because they're all a bit different sizes because there's slow twitch and fast twitch muscles in our slow and fast twitch fibers within our muscle. You would want to activate the slower twitch ones first because they're longer lasting. Yeah, and so now that we're going to review it all back, the slow twitch fibers are thin. The big fast twitch ones are thicker. So in terms of activation, it's going to take less amount of local potentials to activate a slower twitch versus, because it's bigger, it's going to take more stimulation through the local potentials to activate a larger twitch muscle. Yeah, it all conserves energy. So us activating the slower twitch muscles first in the orderly recruitment of motor units, it's all automatic. That's the way our neurological system is designed. Yeah. However, one interesting thing, our body knows, yeah. Well, because, and so Casey is making a joke because our body is so efficient. That's how we evolved, right? Of course, over millions and years of life, humans have been around for 15,000 years. Depending. I mean, it's all simulation, so. Is everyone okay? One interesting thing is that, so we have Henneman's size principle, or the orderly recruitment of muscles. My neuroscience research is looking at how chronic pain and different sensitization levels affect our motor units. And so what we're noticing is that people with chronic pain, or when they have experimentally sensitized areas, the order in which we recruit muscles changes. It doesn't go from smallest to largest anymore. It goes small, jumps to large, and then back to small. Probably because, think of like sore joints, like it hurts to co-contract, right? Like to put pressure on the joint. So it's trying to skip the increased tension into the joints. So that way it can still achieve the goal by activating the big muscles or the big motor units without activating the smaller ones. But that ruins the stability. And so probably people with chronic pain, how they develop arthritis, it's happening at a neurological level, like at the spinal cord. It's not even conscious. So I'm just trying to prove it as a sidebar. So Alexis is saying like compensation. Are you talking about which part? Oh, Yeah, it would be like maybe not compensation. It's like a trying to take away the increased co-contraction of the joint to prevent more pain. Does that make sense? It's just like taking off some of the middle fibers. There's not really compensation in a sense. More of a change. Yeah. Ahmed's asking to repeat that. And so if we've just dictated that there is an orderly recruitment of muscles or of motor units when we're activating a muscle, in chronic pain, the order in which we activate our motor units changes slightly, which would disrupt lots of things, right? So it ruins our efficiency, probably less endurance. People are in pain. They are weaker. They can't last as long. The movements are jerky. So maybe that's not all conscious, obviously. It's all happening on sort of like these reflex or spinal cord levels. Yes. And so as an aside, as a therapist and as sort of researcher in the sort of rehab, the best way to rehab people is you have to get them moving. And the way to start, you just got to get them moving, right? And so using Gentile's taxonomy, or you can develop exercise programs to just start them off at a baseline level and get them to keep going and slowly progress. So it's like I'm evaluating the neurological basis of rehab programs, in a sense. And so this review lecture, we're done now. Unless there's any questions, keep asking. But what I wanted to get across was now through this lecture, we kind of have a better understanding of the neurological basis or the neuromotor basis of movement, how the different parts of our nervous system work together to figure out which muscles to contract and how to contract them. But that's just only one piece of the whole pie. What we're going to be learning about for the rest of the course is how our ability to take sort of information from the environment and add that to the control or neuromotor control of our body is what the essence of motor control is, or skillful movement. Because there's this one study here, I'm going to bring up an example. So it was using the MEG machines. Do you remember from last day we were talking about the big MEG? I don't know if I have a picture. No. But it was like the big white machine, and someone was sitting there. And what it does is it reads all of the electrical activity throughout the brain. So think of this study. And what they had people doing is they had a metronome, and then they had to, can you guys see? They had to tap their finger to the beat of the metronome. So let's say the beat was tick, 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 tick. All they had to do was they had to tap their finger to the beat. And then they measured or looked at, evaluated which parts of the brain are active. Okay? Now, they did another group, I think it might have been the same group, and what they instructed them to do was now tap their finger again, but off beat. So instead it would be tick, wait, tick, 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 tick. So if they're not tapping on the beat, they're tapping off beat. It's the same motion. Like, so if you think of, if our neurological system is just sending an electrical signal out to the motor unit to contract the muscle, the brain activity should be the same. It's the same motion. But because we were telling the body, or the participants in the study were telling the body to go on beat versus off beat, different parts of the brain were active. So us controlling the neurological system is just one piece of motor control. The neuromotor basis is the start, but it's how we cognitively and uncognitively have those, all of that working together, that is the sort of essence of motor control. Does that make sense? Everyone? Booyah. For sure? It's a good review? Feeling okay? Hopefully you're feeling interested. Awesome. That's okay. Now I just reviewed which parts you should remember. Yeah, and that was the part, JP, that I wanted to add this lecture in, just so that way we can tie it in, right? Because I want you to be able to tie in all the information that you're learning in all the courses, this is like obviously mine, together. Because this is in a sense a neuroscience class. It's like, because when you all took the course, the prerequisite was intro to movement neuroscience. Whereas it's obviously different, but now through this hopefully review lecture, you understand how it works together. Okay, great. Any other questions before we go? No questions? Okay, everyone. Have a great weekend. And if you need me, contact me.